Clara Vance stood in the doorway of her modest cabin in rural Georgia, staring at the 3 children she had nursed, fed, and raised for 17 years. They called her Mammy, never mother. But on that humid August morning in 1869, when the plantation records were finally unsealed by federal investigators, she discovered something that would shatter everything she believed about her life. The documents revealed names, dates, and a truth so disturbing that 2 county officials refused to speak of it publicly. What Clara learned that day would force her to confront a question no mother should ever have to answer. Were they truly her master's children? Or had she been deceived in ways far more sinister than she could have imagined? The autumn Clara Vance arrived at the Blackwood Plantation was unremarkable in every way except one. She was 19 years old, recently purchased at auction in Savannah and visibly pregnant. The year was 1852, and the estate sprawled across 800 acres of red Georgia clay, producing cotton and corn in quantities that made Silas Thorne one of the wealthier landowners in Burke County. The main house stood 3 stories tall, painted white with black shutters that never seemed to close completely, giving the windows a perpetually watchful appearance. Silas Thorne was 43, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier along with their infant son. The loss had transformed him from a gregarious host known for elaborate dinner parties into a reclusive figure who spent most evenings in his study drinking whiskey and reviewing ledgers by candlelight. The household staff whispered that he blamed himself, that he'd insisted his wife travel to Savannah late in her pregnancy against the doctor's advice. Clara had belonged to a smaller farm near Augusta before the owner's bankruptcy forced the sale of all assets, including the 12 people he'd enslaved. She never spoke of the father of her unborn child, and no one asked. Such questions were considered impolite among the enslaved community. Everyone carried wounds too deep for casual conversation. The overseer, a thin man named Mr. Croft with permanently sunburned forearms, assigned Clara to work in the main house under the supervision of Maud, the head of household staff who'd served the Thorne family for 26 years. Maud was in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient, with a stern demeanor that concealed a capacity for unexpected kindness. She took one look at Clara's condition and assigned her to light duties, mending clothes, preparing vegetables, and tending the herb garden behind the kitchen. "You'll work until you can't," Maud told her matter-of-factly. "Then you'll rest until you can work again. That's how we survive here. Mr. Thorne don't tolerate laziness, but he ain't cruel like some. You do your work, keep your head down, you'll be treated fair enough." Clara discovered this was largely true. The Blackwood Plantation operated with cold efficiency rather than brutality. There were rules. No one entered the main house through the front door. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one was permitted in Mr. Thorne's study under any circumstances. But the food rations were adequate. The cabins had solid roofs, and Mr. Croft rarely used his whip. It was a kind of prison where the bars were invisible but no less real. In January of 1853, Clara gave birth to a son she named Julian. Maud attended the delivery along with an elderly woman named Esther, who'd brought more than 80 babies into the world. The labor lasted 14 hours. When it was over, Clara held her son and felt something she hadn't experienced since her own mother had been sold away when she was 12. Hope, perhaps not for herself, but for this small life that knew nothing yet of the world's cruelty. She returned to work when Julian was 3 weeks old, strapping him to her back in the traditional way, the rhythm of her movements lulling him to sleep while she worked. Mr. Thorne never acknowledged the child's presence. To him, Clara was simply another piece of property that had produced another piece of property, valuable only insofar as both could work. The seasons turned. Clara proved herself capable and reliable, qualities that earned her grudging respect from the other household staff. She learned the family's preferences. Mr. Thorne took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar, preferred his shirts starched to near stiffness, and would not eat fish on Wednesdays for reasons no one could explain. She learned to move through the house like a ghost, visible only when needed, invisible the rest of the time. Julian grew into a bright, curious child who asked too many questions. By the time he was 3, He'd learned to read from studying the newspapers that lined the kindling box, teaching himself letters and then words with a determination that worried Clara. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people in Georgia. The state had laws against teaching them to read, laws backed by severe punishments. But she couldn't bring herself to discourage his hunger for knowledge. Instead, she taught him to hide it, to never let white people see him reading, to pretend ignorance even when he understood everything being discussed around him. Smart can keep you alive, she told him. But showing you're smart can get you killed. Remember that, Julian. Always remember that. In the spring of 1855, everything changed. Mr. Thorne announced his engagement to Lillian Preston, the 28-year-old daughter of a prominent judge from Augusta. The household exploded into preparation. Every room was cleaned and repainted. New furniture was ordered from Savannah. The gardens were redesigned by a landscape architect from Charleston. Lillian Preston arrived in June with 14 trunks, 2 personal maids, and expectations that would reshape the entire plantation. She was beautiful in the way of delicate china, with pale skin, auburn hair, and green eyes that seemed to catalog everything they observed. But there was something brittle about her, a quality Clara recognized because she'd seen it in abused horses, the constant expectation of pain, the readiness to flinch. The wedding took place in July, a grand affair attended by more than 200 guests. Clara worked in the kitchen for 3 days straight, preparing dishes she'd never tasted. Roasted duck with cherry sauce, 7-layer cakes, custards flavored with vanilla and almond. She watched through the kitchen window as the guests danced on the lawn, their laughter carrying on the humid evening air. It seemed like a scene from another world entirely, one where people could afford to be careless with happiness. Lillian took control of the household with surprising firmness. She rearranged staff assignments, implemented new schedules, and insisted on European-style service that required extensive retraining. She was neither kind nor cruel, simply distant, as if the enslaved people who surrounded her daily were pieces of furniture that happened to move and speak. But she was particularly distant with Clara. She never looked directly at her, never addressed her by name, referred to her only as the girl. Even though Clara was by then 22 years old, Maud noticed but offered no explanation, only a warning. Stay out of her sight much as you can. Some folks got their reasons for the way they are, and those reasons ain't our concern. A year after the wedding, Lillian announced she was pregnant. The household's atmosphere transformed overnight. Mr. Thorne, who'd been somber for years, suddenly smiled at dinner, ordered imported wines, and spoke enthusiastically about the future. Lillian withdrew even further, spending most of her time in her rooms, seeing no one but her personal maids and the doctor who visited weekly from Augusta. The pregnancy was difficult. Lillian suffered constant nausea, headaches so severe she couldn't tolerate light or sound, and fainting spells that left her unconscious for hours. The doctor prescribed bed rest and laudanum, both of which she embraced with an intensity that worried the household staff. In March of 1857, she went into labor. The screaming could be heard throughout the entire house, terrible sounds that seemed to last forever. Clara, working in the kitchen, felt her stomach clench with each cry. She remembered her own labor with Julian, the pain that had felt like dying. But Lillian's screams had a different quality, something beyond physical pain, something that sounded like fury. After 23 hours, a baby girl was born. They named her Isabella, but Lillian refused to hold her. She refused to nurse her. She turned her face to the wall and told Mr. Thorne to get the infant out of her sight. The doctor examined Lillian and declared her suffering from nervous exhaustion, a condition that would require months of rest and isolation to cure. He prescribed increased doses of laudanum and complete separation from the baby until she recovered. No one questioned this. Postpartum melancholia was common enough, particularly after difficult births. Mr. Thorne stood in his study that night, holding his newborn daughter, completely at a loss. She needed to be fed. She needed constant care. The wet nurse they'd arranged had died 2 weeks earlier from pneumonia, and there wasn't time to find another before the baby starved. Maud solved the problem. She knocked on the study door and said 5 words, "Clara can nurse the child." Clara was in her cabin when Maud came for her. She was nursing Julian, who was 4 years old and still sometimes wanted the comfort of his mother's breast before sleep. Maud explained the situation with her characteristic bluntness. Mrs. Thorne couldn't care for baby Isabella. Mr. Thorne needed a wet nurse. Clara was still nursing Julian, which meant she had milk. It wasn't a request. It was never a request. Clara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She'd heard stories of enslaved women forced to nurse white babies while their own children starved. She'd heard of women whose bodies gave all their milk to their master's children, leaving nothing for their own. But she had no choice. So she stood up, wrapped Julian in a blanket, and followed Maud through the dark to the main house. Mr. Thorne met them in the nursery, a room that had been hastily prepared on the 2nd floor. He held Isabella awkwardly, the way men hold babies when they're terrified of breaking them. The infant was screaming, her face red and pinched with hunger. "Feed her," he said to Clara, and left the room. Clara sat in the rocking chair and arranged her clothing. She'd fed Julian just minutes earlier, but she pressed the screaming infant to her breast and felt the small mouth latch on with desperate strength. The crying stopped. The room filled with the sound of suckling and Clara's own racing heartbeat. Julian, who'd been silent and wide-eyed through the entire exchange, whispered, "Mama, hush now." Clara told him, "Everything's going to be all right." But she knew, even as she spoke the words, that she was lying. Nothing was going to be all right. She could feel it in the way baby Isabella fed with such intensity, such hunger, as if she meant to take everything Clara had. And in the months that followed, she nearly did. The arrangement began simply enough. Clara would come to the main house every 4 hours to nurse Isabella. Between feedings, she could return to her cabin to care for Julian and handle her other duties. But within a week, the schedule had changed. Mr. Thorne decided it was inefficient for Clara to travel back and forth. She was moved into a small room adjacent to the nursery, a servant's chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the back gardens. Julian was left in the cabin with an elderly woman named Mammy, who looked after several children while their parents worked. Clara saw him only briefly each day, usually in the early morning or late evening when Maud could spare her for an hour. Each time Julian seemed smaller to her, more distant, as if he were slowly disappearing from her life. "Don't forget me, Mama," he said one evening, and Clara's heart broke into pieces. "Never," she promised. "I could never forget you. You're my son, my own boy." But Isabella became her entire world by necessity. Newborns are relentless, demanding creatures, and Isabella was no exception. She nursed every 2 hours, day and night, for months. She had colic that made her scream for hours until Clara learned to lay her on her stomach across her lap and rub her back in slow circles. She developed a rash that covered her entire body, requiring constant baths and applications of calendula ointment. She wouldn't sleep unless someone was holding her. So Clara learned to sleep sitting upright in the rocking chair, the baby against her chest, waking at the slightest movement. Mr. Thorne visited the nursery daily, usually in the evening. He would stand over the cradle and watch Isabella sleep with an expression Clara couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly love. It was more like surveillance, as if he were checking to make sure she still existed. He never asked about Julian. He never acknowledged that Clara had her own child who needed her. To him, she was simply a function, a source of nutrition for his daughter, as impersonal as a bottle or a feeding schedule. Lillian never came to the nursery. According to the maids who attended her, she spent her days in bed, drifting in and out of laudanum dreams, occasionally asking about the weather or what was being served for dinner, but never mentioning her daughter. The doctor continued his weekly visits and pronounced her condition unchanged. Nervous exhaustion requiring complete rest and isolation. As Isabella grew, Clara found herself developing feelings she'd never expected. Affection, tenderness, even a kind of love for this child who wasn't hers. She told herself it was natural that any woman who spends every waking moment caring for an infant would form an attachment. But it felt more complicated than that. It felt like a betrayal of Julian, of herself, of everything she believed about survival and resistance in a system designed to destroy both. When Isabella was 6 months old, Lillian died. She'd taken too much laudanum one evening, whether intentionally or accidentally, no one could say. They found her in the morning, pale and cold in her elaborate bed, her face peaceful for perhaps the first time since her wedding day. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by prominent families from across the region. Mr. Thorne stood beside the grave with Isabella in his arms, stone-faced and silent. Clara watched from a distance, holding Julian's hand, feeling the guilt of being glad that Lillian was gone, because it meant Isabella would need her even more completely now. After Lillian's death, the household settled into a new rhythm. Mr. Thorne became both father and mother to Isabella, though in practice this meant Clara continued to provide all actual care while he made decisions about her upbringing. He hired a tutor for when she'd be old enough for lessons. He ordered elaborate dresses from Savannah and Charleston. He commissioned a portrait painter to capture her image every year on her birthday. When Isabella was 2, Mr. Thorne married again, this time to a widow named Martha Caldwell from Macon. Martha was 41, practical rather than beautiful, with 3 grown children from her first marriage, and no interest in having more. She ran the household with efficient indifference, neither cruel nor kind, simply ensuring everything functioned smoothly. She never interfered with Clara's care of Isabella. 2 years after that marriage, Martha gave birth unexpectedly to twins, a boy and a girl they named Edward and Victoria. The pregnancy had been a surprise, the delivery quick and without complications. Martha recovered rapidly, but she had no interest in nursing. She'd hired a wet nurse for her first 3 children and saw no reason to change that practice now. Except there was a problem. The wet nurse they'd arranged became ill with influenza and couldn't take the position, and Clara was still nursing Isabella, who was 4 but refused to be weaned. Mr. Thorne made the obvious decision. Clara would nurse all 3 children. Maud brought Clara the news with an apologetic expression. "I know it ain't right," she said quietly. "I know it ain't fair, but you know how it is." Clara did know. She always knew. She took the twins into her care, arranged them on her lap with Isabella curled against her side, and fed them all while Julian watched from the doorway with eyes that had grown old far too young. He was 9 years old now, tall and thin, working in the fields because he was too old for the cabin nursery and too young for skilled work. "You got 3 children now," he said to her one evening, his voice flat. "White children. Must be nice having children that matter." "Julian, no." Clara reached for him, but he stepped back. "It's fine, Mama. I understand how it works. I've always understood." He left the room, and Clara sat in the darkness with Isabella sleeping against her shoulder, feeling the truth of his words like a knife between her ribs. The years passed. Isabella grew into a bright, affectionate child who called Clara Mammy and seemed genuinely fond of her. Edward and Victoria were more difficult. They were demanding, prone to tantrums, and showed early signs of their father's cold temperament. But Clara cared for them all with the same meticulous attention, because her survival depended on it. If anything happened to these children, she would be blamed. If they were unhappy, she would be punished. Her entire existence had become synonymous with their well-being. Julian grew up at a distance from her. He worked in the fields, learned carpentry from the estate's handyman, and became a quiet, serious young man who spoke rarely and smiled never. When they saw each other, which was seldom, he was polite but distant, calling her ma'am instead of mama, as if they were strangers rather than mother and son. "I lost him," Clara told Maud one night, the words pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "You didn't lose him," Maud said. "He's just protecting himself the only way he knows how. Can't blame a boy for that." But Clara did blame someone. She blamed Mr. Thorne, who'd taken her body's very capacity to nurture and redirected it toward his own children. She blamed the system that made such theft legal and routine. And she blamed herself, though she knew that was irrational, for not finding a way to resist. In April of 1865, word reached the plantation that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen, and with it, the entire system of slavery that had defined the South for 2.5 centuries. Mr. Thorne called a meeting of all the enslaved people on the estate. There were 63 of them, gathered in front of the main house on a warm spring evening. He stood on the porch, his face gray with exhaustion and something that might have been defeat. "You're free," he told them. "As of now, you're all free. You can stay and work for wages or you can go. The choice is yours." There was silence. No one cheered. No one wept. They simply stood there trying to comprehend what freedom meant when you'd never known anything but bondage. That night, Clara sat in the small room adjacent to the nursery, still her room after 13 years, and tried to imagine leaving. But where would she go? She had no family, no connections, no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on her back. And she had Isabella, Edward, and Victoria who depended on her completely. Mr. Thorne had never been deliberately cruel to her. The plantation was the only home she could remember clearly. The practical choice, the safe choice, was to stay. The next morning, she told Mr. Thorne she would remain and work for wages. He looked relieved and offered her $7 a month plus room and board. It was exploitation, though not as severe as slavery had been. She accepted because the alternative was starvation. Most of the formerly enslaved people made the same choice, at least initially. Some left within weeks or months, drawn by promises of opportunity in Atlanta or Savannah or up north. But others stayed because leaving required resources they didn't have and courage they couldn't quite summon after a lifetime of being told they were property. Julian left in June. He was 16, tall and capable, literate thanks to his years of secret study. He came to Clara's room one evening and said, "I'm going to Savannah, going to find work on the docks. Maybe sign onto a ship. I need to see what's out there, Mama." Clara wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted to tell him the world was dangerous and he was still so young. But she looked at his face and saw the determination there, the desperate need to become something other than what this place had made him. "You write me," she said. "You promise you'll write me." "I promise," he said and hugged her briefly before pulling away. "I got to go now before I lose my nerve." She watched him walk down the long drive in the dawn light, carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag, and felt something inside her finally break completely. The years after the war were difficult for everyone, but particularly for the Thorne household. The plantation's income dropped dramatically as the labor force shrank and cotton prices fluctuated wildly. Mr. Thorne sold parcels of land to cover debts. Martha's jewelry was quietly pawned in Augusta. The household staff was reduced to just 5 people: Maud, Clara, a cook named Pearl, and 2 men who handled outdoor work and maintenance. Isabella, Edward, and Victoria grew up in this diminished world, unaware that they were experiencing decline rather than normalcy. Isabella was their father's favorite, though he'd never admit it aloud. She was clever and kind, with her mother Lillian's beauty but none of her brittleness. She read voraciously, played piano beautifully, and asked thoughtful questions about everything from politics to philosophy. The twins, by contrast, seemed determined to embody every negative stereotype of spoiled Southern gentry. Edward was arrogant and lazy, constantly reminding the household staff of their inferior status. Victoria was vain and manipulative, skilled at playing her parents against each other to get what she wanted. Clara continued to care for all 3 children, though the nature of her duties evolved as they aged. By the time Isabella was 14, Clara's role had shifted from nursemaid to something closer to a personal servant, arranging her clothes, styling her hair, helping her dress for social occasions. She still felt affection for Isabella, even love, though she'd learned to keep those feelings carefully compartmentalized. This was her job now, nothing more. Julian wrote occasionally, brief letters that arrived every few months describing his life in Savannah. He'd found work at the shipyards, then later as a clerk for a shipping company. He'd learned bookkeeping and navigation. He'd joined a church and made friends. He was building a life, and Clara was proud of him, even as she mourned the distance between them. "Why does Mammy cry when she gets letters?" Victoria asked one day, watching Clara carefully fold one of Julian's notes and tuck it into her apron pocket. "Because she's foolish," Edward answered before Clara could respond. Daddy says colored people are too emotional for their own good. That ain't true, Isabella said sharply. Mammy's not foolish. Maybe she misses someone. Maybe the letter is from family. You don't have family, do you, Mammy? Victoria asked with the casual cruelty of a child who doesn't understand the impact of her words. I thought all your people died or ran off. Clara swallowed the rage that rose in her throat and forced her voice to remain level. I have a son. His name is Julian. He lives in Savannah. The three children stared at her. It was perhaps the first time Clara had ever volunteered personal information about her life. You have a son? Isabella said slowly. But I never knew that. Why didn't I know that? You never asked, Miss Isabella. Isabella's face flushed, and she looked genuinely distressed. That's not fair. I should have known. You've been taking care of us our whole lives, and I don't know anything about you. That's how it's supposed to be, Edward said dismissively. They're not our friends, Isabella. They're servants. She raised us, Isabella said, her voice rising. Don't you understand that? She fed us and held us and sat up with us when we were sick. Doesn't that mean anything? Edward shrugged. It means she was doing her job. Daddy paid her, didn't he? The conversation ended there, but something had shifted in Isabella. She started asking Clara questions about her life before the plantation, about her parents, about Julian. Clara answered carefully, never revealing too much, always conscious that these children were still her employer's children, and anything she said could be used against her. In 1868, when Isabella was 16, she announced her intention to attend a female seminary in Macon. Mr. Thorne was reluctant. He preferred to keep her close, but Isabella insisted with the kind of polite stubbornness that eventually wore down opposition. She would go for 2 years, study literature and music and natural philosophy, and then return to prepare for marriage and the management of her own household. The night before Isabella left, she came to Clara's room for the first time in years. She stood in the doorway, already dressed in traveling clothes, looking nervous. I wanted to thank you, she said formally, for everything you've done for me. I know I haven't always, I understand now that things were complicated. Are complicated. Clara sat on her narrow bed and looked at this young woman she'd nursed and raised, who'd called her Mammy but never mother, who'd taken her time and energy and love as if it was simply owed rather than given. You're a good girl, Miss Isabella? Clara said, because it was true and because kindness cost nothing. You study hard and make yourself into someone strong. Will you still be here when I come back? Isabella asked, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like worry. I expect so, Clara said. Don't have anywhere else to go. Isabella left the next morning. The house felt emptier without her, though Clara would never have admitted it aloud. In the spring of 1869, everything changed. A letter arrived from the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the federal agency tasked with overseeing reconstruction in the South. The letter requested that Mr. Thorne make available all plantation records relating to enslaved people purchased, born, or sold between 1850 and 1865. It was part of a regional effort to help formerly enslaved people locate separated family members and establish legal documentation of their birth and parentage. Mr. Thorne was furious. He ranted at dinner about federal overreach and the indignity of having his private business examined by government bureaucrats. But he complied because refusing would bring unwanted scrutiny to the plantation's finances and potentially expose other irregularities in his business practices. 2 agents arrived in August, a white man named Agent Mercer and a black man named Agent Brooks, both formally dressed and carrying leather document cases. They set up in the plantation office and spent 3 days reviewing ledgers, bills of sale, birth records, and correspondence. On the 3rd day, Agent Brooks asked to speak with Clara Vance. Maud came to find her in the kitchen where she was helping Pearl prepare preserves. They want to talk to you, Maud said, her expression unreadable. The government men. Something about the old records. Clara's stomach clenched with unease. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Maud to the office, trying to imagine what they could possibly want with her. Agent Brooks stood when she entered. He was perhaps 40, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He gestured to a chair across from the desk. "Please sit down, Mrs. Vance." Mrs. Vance. No one had ever called her that before. She sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Agent Mercer remained standing, shuffling through papers. Agent Brooks opened a leather-bound ledger and turned it so Clara could see the pages. They were filled with Mr. Thorne's precise handwriting. Names, dates, prices, physical descriptions, notes about health and capability. "Can you read, Mrs. Vance?" Brooks asked gently. "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm going to show you several entries, and I need you to tell me if you can confirm the information." He pointed to a line near the top of the page. "Is this you? Clara Vance. Purchased September 1852. Age 19. Pregnant from the estate auction of Marcus Dalton. Price $400. Clara looked at the words, at the clinical description of her own sale, and felt bile rise in her throat. "Yes, sir. That's me." Brooks turned several pages. "And this entry here, dated January 14th, 1853. It says, Clara delivered of a male child named Julian, healthy weight, expected to be suitable for fieldwork at age 10. Is that your son?" "Yes, sir." "And where is Julian now?" "Savannah, sir. He left after the war. He writes me sometimes." Brooks nodded and made a note. Then he turned more pages, his fingers sliding down columns of dates and names until he stopped at an entry from March 1857. "This is where things become complicated, Mrs. Vance," he said quietly. "I need you to look at this entry carefully and tell me if you notice anything unusual." Clara leaned forward to read. The entry said, March 18th, 1857. Delivery of female child Isabella Lillian Thorne, born to Lillian Preston Thorne. Attended by Dr. William Patterson of Augusta. Healthy weight, no complications noted. "I don't understand," Clara said. "That's Miss Isabella's birth record. What does that have to do with me?" Agent Brooks exchanged a glance with Agent Mercer, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Brooks pulled out another document. This one an official form with embossed seals and multiple signatures. "This," Brooks said, "is the birth certificate filed with Burke County for Isabella Thorne. It was submitted by Dr. Patterson in April of 1857, a month after the birth." He laid it on the desk beside the ledger entry. "I need you to read it carefully." Clara looked at the document. Most of it matched what she just read in the ledger. Date of birth, location, parents' names. But then she reached a section at the bottom filled out in different handwriting, and her breath stopped in her chest. The section was labeled Wet Nurse Employed, and it listed a name, Clara Vance. That was expected. But beneath that, in small, precise letters, was another entry. Note: infant bore visible birthmark on left shoulder, 3/4 inch in diameter, resembling dark star. Wet Nurse Clara Vance inquired about identity of marking, suggesting possible relation. Dr. Patterson noted marking present. No medical concern noted. Clara's hands began to shake. She looked up at Agent Brooks, her mind refusing to process what she was reading. "I don't," she whispered. "I don't understand." Brooks's voice was in